Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on one of the toughest economic puzzles in the world.
You really are.
We're looking at the relentless cycle of inflation and structural fragility in modern Iran.
And this deep dive, it's built entirely around a really sharp, comprehensive analysis from Dr. Abdulhamid Hosseini, who's a senior Iranian-Australian economic sociologist.
That's right. And our mission today is really to present this source material as thoroughly as we can.
Because Dr. Hosseini makes a powerful case. He argues that the persistent, debilitating economic challenges facing Iran, they're just not solvable by applying the standard economic playbook.
The one we all learned in school.
Exactly. Those theories were, for the most part, written for stable, advanced Western economies. If you only look at the numbers, you are absolutely going to miss the story.
You miss the story. I like that. The source, it posits that the economy is trapped in a loop.
A feedback loop.
Right, where political, social, and economic forces, they aren't just related, they're actually mutually reinforcing this inflation cycle. Okay, so let's unpack this. We're trying to move past the superficial narratives you always hear.
The usual media sound bites or, the political rhetoric.
Yeah, that simplifies a whole nation's economy down to too much money chasing too few goods. We need to understand the structural trap.
And that's the central insight we get from Dr. Hosseini's work. It's this. Economic explanations for inflation, especially in developing nations, are often just far too simplistic.
Right.
To really get Iran's specific situation, you have to recognize that inflation isn't a singular thing. It's a complex, multi-layered beast.
And it's driven by factors that are reciprocal.
Right.
They feed back into each other.
They feed back into each other, and crucially, they extend way beyond the Ministry of Finance. I mean, they're deeply rooted in social stratification, and the political architecture, and even in cultural behaviors.
So today, we're going to use his framework as our map, really dissecting the three crucial interwoven types of inflation that are, currently plaguing the system.
So we should probably start with what the source calls the complexity trap. Dr. Hosseini is highly critical of this tendency for media and political leaders to just rely on overly simplified and often, frankly, misleading explanations for inflation.
And this is especially true when they just focus narrowly on one thing, like the growth of liquidity.
Exactly. It's the classic difference between a textbook principle and the messy real-world application.
The textbook definition is so clean, isn't it? A supply curve, a demand curve.
Right. But reality introduces these massive variables, things like sanctions, monopolies, ingrained corruption.
And the source points out that the true factors are complex, reciprocal, and they extend far beyond just economic metrics. They go into the social, the cultural, the political realms.
Yeah, so no single factor, like just printing money, is the sole culprit. They all interact to create this inflationary ecosystem.
So to create a common vocabulary before we dive deep into those connections, the source anchors its analysis using the three standard types of inflation you'd find in any intro textbook.
Right, but we use these as analytical buckets, knowing that in the Iranian context, they are constantly bleeding into one another.
Okay, so type 1, demand pull inflation. This is the one most people find easiest to grasp.
The classic.
It happens when the overall demand for goods and services is just growing faster than the economy's ability to supply them, either through domestic production or through imports.
Simply put, too much demand, not enough supply, so prices rise.
Then you have type 2, cost push inflation.
And this is a different beast entirely. It's driven by the rising cost of inputs.
So everything a producer needs to make something or deliver a service.
Exactly. This includes increases in the price of labor, so wages, technology, rent, or land prices, raw materials, and critically, the cost of capital, which we see reflected in high interest rates.
And those increased production costs, they are inevitably passed directly to the consumer, pushing prices up even if demand stays flat.
And that brings us to type 3, currency or exchange rate inflation.
And this one, it feels like it signals a crisis of confidence.
That's precisely what it is. It occurs because people, they reduce their demand for the national currency. They're actively seeking alternatives.
Things like foreign currencies, gold, real estate, anything really to preserve the value of their wealth.
And when the value of that national currency plummets, it makes imports prohibitively expensive and, it signals economic chaos.
The key insight here, then, is that in Iran, We aren't dealing with just one of these.
Not at all. We are dealing with a destructive triad where all three types are not only present but are constantly accelerating each other in a vicious cycle.
Let's start with that demand pull type and, specifically address the monetary school's great boogeyman, liquidity.
Ah, yes, liquidity.
The standard view holds that liquidity, so the money supply and how fast it circulates, sometimes called nectogeny, is the main driver of inflation.
And this analysis argues against that classic textbook view, the one most of us learned, that liquidity is the simple bad guy. Let's see how Dr. Hosseini kind of flips that script.
So what's his argument?
Well, he argues that the relationship between liquidity and inflation is actually complex, reciprocal, and often just outright false as a sole cause.
So it's not that simple.
Not at all. Liquidity is essential for mediating transactions. An economy must have it. It only causes inflation if the increased circulation of money isn't matched by a corresponding increase in the supply of goods and services.
So if production keeps up, then liquidity growth is just a sign of a growing economy.
Exactly. It's evidence of economic expansion.
And the sources of liquidity are broad, right? We have the government printing money, which is the classic inflation fear.
Right. Then there's the banking system creating credit through lending, public work spending, or just general wage increases.
The crucial distinction then is this. If the money goes into a productive channel, it creates supply. If it goes into a speculative channel, it only creates price distortion.
And that distinction brings us to the core issue he identifies, the distribution divide.
This is where the sociological part of the analysis really hits home.
It does. Dr. Hosseini emphasizes that we cannot talk about liquidity without discussing how that liquidity is distributed within the society. This is the structural flaw that turns necessary money flow into, well, inflationary poison.
So if the distribution of wealth were relatively equal, let's say new money flowed mainly to the working and productive classes.
Then that money would be spent immediately on necessities, increasing demand.
And that stable demand would encourage investment and production, boosting supply.
Which can actually help reduce the inflation rate over time by meeting that new demand.
But the Iranian context, according to this analysis, is, well, it's the opposite of that. It's characterized by vast and growing class differences, political rents, financial monopolies.
And in that scenario, liquidity distribution is severely skewed. Money concentrates very quickly in the hands of the financial elite and powerful monopolies, and it avoids productive investment.
And this is what the source calls stray liquidity.
Use liquidity.
What does this stray liquidity do? It seeks the highest, fastest, easiest return.
Of course.
It avoids the messy, long-term commitment of, say, building a factory. And instead, it finances speculation, or Dalali.
We're talking about things like buying up thousands of empty apartments in Tehran just to hold them as assets.
Or hoarding massive stocks of commodities, things like rice, sugar, or building materials, just betting that scarcity will drive the prices up.
And that speculative liquidity is immediately funneled into buying foreign currency, gold, or other hard assets.
And that last action, the massive concerted effort by the financial elite to buy foreign currency, that directly and powerfully causes type 3 inflation, the currency inflation.
It does, because it drains confidence and it reduces the internal demand for the national currency, which just accelerates its devaluation.
So that's the structural weakness right there. And then we hit this economic irony of the export-driven scarcity.
Right. You might have a productive sector that's technically robust, but if domestic wages and purchasing power are still low, that production is just disconnected from the domestic market.
The profit-maximizing producer in that environment, what are they going to do? They'll look to export their goods.
Food, raw materials, refined products, anything they can sell for coveted foreign currency where the margins are highest.
And that drains the domestic supply. It creates scarcity and feeds demand pull inflation at home, even though the country is producing a lot.
This scarcity can only be counteracted if the government is strong enough to enforce tax laws, collect those export revenues efficiently, and then use that capital to effectively import cheap essential goods for the populace.
But the structural weakness, which is fueled by neoliberal adjustments and privatization, often prevents this efficient redistribution from happening.
And this cycle is further intensified by what the source calls neoliberal policies and rent-seeking behavior.
Okay.
Dr. Hosseini traces the system's shift, this dramatic shift towards speculation, Dalali, back to a reliance on comparative advantages. So oil and gas coupled with non-democratic privatization efforts.
And non-democratic is the key word here.
It's absolutely the key. The transfer of state assets to private hands happened without any real civil oversight or union input. It essentially empowered these well-connected financial groups.
The consequence is stark, isn't it? Monopolies, having acquired these cheap state assets, just intensify their speculative activities.
And that severely weakens the sector that produces essential goods for the public.
Which forces the country into this chronic dependence on imports just to control prices. And import dependency. Well, that's the ultimate vulnerability. It's like an open wound.
Because that dependence ties the entire domestic economy to the whims of the US dollar and global exchange rates.
And that dramatically increases its vulnerability to external pressures, things like sanctions, tariffs, or fluctuations in foreign loan interest rates, a dynamic we've seen destabilize other developing economies in the region.
And this leads to a crucial feedback loop connecting Type 1, that demand pull, to Type 3, the currency inflation. The export-focused economic liberalization actually incentivizes these powerful monopolies to actively work to reduce the value of the national currency.
Wait, that's counterintuitive. Why would they do that?
By hoarding their foreign exchange earnings abroad, or by deliberately delaying the return of that hard currency to the domestic market. You see, a weaker reserve means their existing dollar reserves are worth more in local currency terms.
Massively boosting their local profits.
Exactly. And this pits the government between two impossible demands.
On one side, importers of essential goods, food, medicine, they're demanding a cheap, subsidized currency rate to keep their production costs down.
That's import rent seeking.
And on the other side, the exporters and monopolies, they want an expensive national currency, a high exchange rate for the dollar, to maximize their own profits in local terms.
So the government, which is unable to create supply or enforce production, just resorts to constantly trying to manage these conflicting demands through subsidies and fluctuating rates.
Which just fuels corruption and profit-seeking from the gaps between these rates.
Meanwhile, the actual solution-boosting productive capacity is ignored in favor of just managing the financial symptoms.
And all of this rolls into the political feedback loop.
Right. The structural economic dependence born from these neoliberal adjustments creates profound political vulnerability.
So when the political system tries to resist external dependency, it faces tension and sanctions.
And those sanctions then weaken the domestic economy, they deepen class gaps, and crucially, they concentrate political power internally, as only a centralized authority can even attempt to manage the crisis.
And this centralized, closed system then struggles profoundly against internal corruption and monopolies, which, the source warns, sometimes infiltrate or even become functionally integrated into the state apparatus itself.
Using complex methods like money laundering to protect their speculative wealth and influence policy decisions.
So if we step back and look at the class structure and the sustainability of inflation, we can see why this cycle is so hard to break.
High inflation is supposed to self-correct, right? Prices rise, demand falls, a recession hits, prices stabilize.
But for essential goods, food, fuel, basic necessities, demand pull continues relentlessly, as long as people can dedicate a greater and greater share of their shrinking income just to survive.
I like the analogy of inflation as a tide.
How so?
For the financial elite, they're on a yacht that just rises with the water. They might even profit from the turbulence. But for the poor and the working class, they're standing on the shore, watching the water rise up over their heads, drowning their ability to meet basic needs.
That's a powerful image.
It is, because society is so highly stratified. The wealthier classes maintain their purchasing power or even profit from speculation, while the poor must dedicate, 80 or 90% of their income just to survive.
So Dr. Hosseini concludes that this social injustice and deep class inequality are the primary drivers in sustaining and intensifying inflation.
Right. They prevent that natural self-correcting slowdown that conventional economic models would predict.
Let's move on now to how this distortion of the money supply translates into concrete rising costs, our type 2 cost-push inflation.
So this is all about rising input costs being transferred to the consumer.
And we need to look closely at these input costs, maybe starting with the nuance of wages. When do wage increases cause inflation versus when do they curb it?
In a deregulated market, sure. If wage hikes significantly exceed the rate of inflation, or if producers just transfer that increased labor cost directly to consumers in a market that lacks price controls, then yes, wages can contribute to inflation.
What?
But the source makes a very important distinction, which is common in developing economies. In Iran, total inflation is usually always higher than the rate of wage increases.
So the key takeaway is that when wages rise, if they don't outpace inflation, the effect isn't generally inflationary.
Right. Instead, in a healthy, productive economy, higher wages would boost worker demand, which stimulates production and increases supply. It can even help reduce currency inflation by promoting economic confidence and domestic consumption.
But the problem arises because the economy is primarily speculative.
Precisely. In that case, the limited wage increases might only cause a mild increase in demand pull inflation because there's no robust productive sector ready to respond to that increased demand with greater supply.
The production side is crippled, so any small increase in demand just hits a hard wall of scarcity.
But the major drivers of cost push are really the non-wage inputs: raw materials, technology, land, and capital.
And here's where the types connect powerfully. This is that recursive loop we were talking about.
Yes. The source explicitly links a rising price of these non-wage inputs directly back to type 1 inflation, specifically the problem of that stray liquidity.
So when stray liquidity is concentrated in the hands of monopolies and there's no production-focused economy to absorb it, that money doesn't just disappear.
It attacks commodities, land, and raw materials. Monopolies hoard strategic inputs, driving up their prices.
And these artificially high input costs, which are driven by speculation and financial maneuvers, not by genuine industrial necessity, are then factored into production costs,
Generating cost-push inflation across the board. The financial sector is, in essence, weaponizing essential commodities.
And we can't discuss input costs without addressing the banking feedback loop.
This is where the price of money itself, the interest rate, becomes an inflationary input.
Dr. Hosseini argues that inflation cannot be lower than the bank interest rate in the medium to long term.
Okay, let's break down that mechanism step by step.
Please.
Banks have to raise interest rates, often dramatically high, to attract liquidity. They're trying to draw that stray money back into the financial system, which might temporarily slow the velocity of money.
But a bank has to pay that high interest to its depositors.
Which means the bank must, in turn, charge an even higher interest rate on the loans it gives out to businesses and investors.
So for any productive venture, a factory, a sustainable farm, those high borrowing costs become part of the business's production expenses.
Right. The business owner has to generate profit above and beyond those costs, so they have no choice but to pass the expense of that high interest rate on to the customer by increasing the price of their goods and services.
That is pure, undeniable cost-push inflation, and it's being fueled by the banking sector itself.
The central bank's main tool for curbing inflation, raising interest rates, instead becomes a mechanism for generating higher prices and greater fragility in the medium term.
And on top of that, high interest rates push investors toward quick speculative investments, the Dalali.
Of course. If you're faced with a 25% interest rate on a loan to build a factory that takes 5 years to turn a profit,
Compared to a quick, low-effort investment in hoarded currency or real estate that might yield 35% in 6 months.
speculation becomes a mathematical necessity for survival. This just rapidly accelerates the shift away from difficult, long-term productive activity, reinforcing the whole structural weakness.
And this instability is compounded severely by the rise of private and shadow banking.
The privatization of banks, combined with the lack of financial discipline and regulatory oversight, leads to reckless credit creation.
So they offer excessively high interest rates to attract liquidity.
And then, critically, they direct loans away from productive industry, which is now too risky because of the high rates, and they push it into non-productive sectors like land, luxury housing, and financial assets.
The result is widespread inflationary bubble formation.
In housing, in currency, in the stock market, in precious metals, you name it.
And this bubble growth does two things. First, it creates no essential goods, only asset inflation, which reduces purchasing power for the majority.
And second, it always increases inequality. It benefits the financial insiders who ride the bubble and, get off at the right time.
While profoundly harming those who can't participate or are caught when the inevitable burst or stagnation happens.
And in the ultimate feedback loop, that increased inequality just fuels the speculative stray liquidity right back into the system, seeking the next bubble opportunity.
Proving that the banking sector is now structurally geared to amplify instability rather than immediate growth.
So let's turn to type 3, currency inflation. This is often the most visible symptom of the crisis, and it's where external shocks play an enormous role.
The impact of sanctions and external tensions is immediate and severe on the value of the national currency.
They reduce necessary imports, they cut off the supply of foreign currency from legitimate exports, and they dramatically increase the cost of doing business.
Because of what are termed circumvention costs.
And these aren't just minor fees, these are the expenses of using intermediaries, paying higher rates for delayed transactions, dealing with increased political risk, and even corruption fees to bypass trade restrictions.
So these circumvention costs are effectively an invisible tax on all imports and exports.
They reduce government revenue as legitimate trade shrinks, and at the same time, they massively increase the profit margins of the financial monopolies that specialize in navigating this complex and dangerous currency and trade environment.
They become the essential gatekeepers of foreign exchange.
And this devaluation fuels the capital flight and smuggling crisis.
When the national currency is rapidly devaluing, it creates an overwhelming financial incentive to convert local assets into foreign currency,
which drives official exports sell fast to get dollars and accelerates smuggled exports as actors seek to purchase higher value foreign currency for wealth preservation or just quick profit.
And the state's structural weakness, born from privatization and downsizing, is exploited here.
If the government has weakened its control over national borders and trade, its ability to combat smuggling is severely compromised.
So a wide spectrum of actors, from small-time cross-border smugglers all the way up to major financial institutions, they all participate.
Reducing the domestic supply of essential goods and raising local prices through scarcity, it's a devastating double punch.
The goods are leaving the country.
And the profits are staying abroad in hard currency, compounding the scarcity and the currency devaluation simultaneously.
And finally, there is this devastating issue of the resource giveaway.
When the government is under intense political pressure, often from the revenue loss caused by sanctions, it may be compelled to grant foreign companies, whether they're state-owned or private, exclusive rights to exploit domestic resources in exchange for immediate cash or political favors.
And Dr. Hosseini offers a very sobering example of this.
Yes, the reduced fish catch is granted to foreign interests. This damages the local fishing industries, which are often the lifeblood of coastal communities.
It raises domestic food prices due to scarcity, and it fundamentally undermines the domestic production base.
Trading away long-term self-sufficiency and environmental health for short-term, unsustainable revenue, this act just exemplifies the political vulnerability caused by economic dependence.
Wow. This analysis it's deep, it's interconnected, and frankly, it's quite alarming.
It is.
If we pull back from all this complexity, the diagnosis is clear. Iran is currently suffering from all three types of inflation demand pull, cost push, and currency.
And they are not independent problems. They are mutually reinforcing one another in a relentless, accelerating cycle.
We have to summarize this vicious cycle.
Okay. Sanctions and external tensions created a psychological shock that initiated currency inflation type 3.
And this shock occurred within an environment that was already defined by a speculative economy, weak governance, and deeply unequal wealth distribution.
This volatility led financial players to engage in hoarding, commodity speculation, and capital flight.
And when essential imports became more difficult and expensive due to sanctions, and goods were hoarded internally,
then demand pull, type 1, and cost push, type 2, inflation intensified dramatically, pushing the entire structure closer to collapse.
So the source identifies the core inefficiency at the heart of the crisis,
which is that the economy is inherently inflationary as long as there are lucrative, low-effort avenues to generate wealth and income from money itself.
From financial speculation, from hoarding commodities, from currency trading,
rather than investing the effort and capital into the actual production of essential goods for the society.
When speculation is easier and safer than production, the economy will inevitably be consumed by speculators.
To truly grasp the fragility of the system and, understand why hyperinflated is a real risk, we have to detail the precise structural factors that Dr. Hosseini identified.
This is the foundation of the problem, the 12 pillars of the card house.
Let's go through them. Number 1, severe socioeconomic inequalities and class disparity.
We've touched on this, but structurally, it means high-income groups have access to financial instruments and speculative markets that are fundamentally inflationary,
while low-income groups can only afford to dedicate all their money to essential consumption, which guarantees continuous demand pull for basics. The structure itself is designed to amplify the effects of inflation on the most vulnerable.
Okay, number 2.
The misguided structural adjustment policies that prioritized state downsizing and privatization over democratization and accountability.
This wasn't just economic policy, it was a political transfer of power.
Exactly. By dissolving public enterprises and selling state assets non-democratically, it empowered a cohort of unelected financial groups and private interests to amass massive economic power without any corresponding public or civil oversight, unions, or parliamentary checks.
Number 3.
The weakening of support for domestic producers through the reduction of necessary subsidies or protective tariffs.
And while subsidies can be inefficient, their sudden withdrawal, often done to reduce state expenditures, just exposes nascent domestic industries to ruthless international competition or to manipulation by powerful domestic cartels.
Ultimately reducing long-term productive capacity.
Number 4. The aggressive price liberalization and erosion of state control over prices and distribution.
Historically, state control mechanisms, price caps, and regulated distribution provided a buffer for low-income citizens to access essentials.
And removing those mechanisms quickly, without establishing strong anti-monopoly regulations, exposed the public to the full predatory force of speculative market dynamics.
Number 5. The unregulated growth of financial monopolies and rent-seeking. This refers not just to hoarding, but to the systemic extraction of wealth from the economy without contributing any value.
These monopolies operate with minimal regulatory oversight, amplifying their speculative power by exploiting gaps in subsidized exchange rates and leveraging their political connections to get lucrative, non-competitive deals.
Number 6. The massive shift in economic weight toward finance speculation, Dalali, and away from the real productive economy.
For decades, the system has gradually geared itself toward making money from money rather than from making goods, building infrastructure, or creating essential services.
It's a slow poison, diverting capital away from genuine growth engines.
What's number 7?
The severe weakening of the ability to achieve self-sufficiency in basic needs. This forces reliance on volatile global supply chains for necessities like food and medicine.
And when a nation can't feed or heal itself, it loses economic sovereignty. It becomes profoundly vulnerable to external political pressure and supply shocks, which immediately translate into Type 1 and Type 2 inflation.
Number 8. The growing reliance on raw petroleum exports and cash crop exports for quick foreign currency.
Overdeveloping sustainable, modernized domestic food production that actually conserves scarce resources like water.
This creates an unsustainable boom-bust cycle where the economy is entirely dependent on commodity price fluctuations and the ability to export raw materials rather than adding value through processing or manufacturing.
Number 9.
The increased external financial dependency. This is a critical point. The domestic speculative class has deep connections with international capital,
Which facilitates easy asset transfer and capital flight.
If a businessman in Tehran can easily shift millions of dollars to a safe haven abroad with the cooperation of international financial partners, the domestic economy is just constantly leaking vital resources.
Number 10 is the lack of public control.
Meaning control through an elected government, accountable judicial mechanisms, and civil society over crucial financial trade and currency exchanges.
When these critical valves of the national economy are opaque and dominated by a few powerful unelected actors, they are inherently prone to exploitation and rent-seeking.
Number 11, the replacement of long-term strategic economic planning with mere crisis management.
So policy becomes defined by just constant manipulation of single variables.
Yeah.
Raising interest rates one month, changing the exchange rate subsidy the next.
Always reacting to the latest emergency rather than tackling the structural roots, ensuring the crisis never truly ends.
And finally, number 12.
The unregulated private and shadow banking sector, which fuels asset bubbles and destabilizes the entire financial architecture through reckless credit creation directed at non-productive assets, guaranteeing cycles of boom, bust, and concentrated wealth transfer.
It's an indictment of the system itself. And the structural conclusion is that the entire system is a card house.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The pre-sanction warning.
What's that?
The mere probability of external sanctions or regional tensions shakes the structural foundation even before they're implemented.
Because speculators and capital immediately act to safeguard their wealth by buying foreign currency.
Thus triggering Type 3 inflation prematurely through expectation alone.
Wow.
The author wraps up this whole diagnostic section by posing the crucial question of hyperinflation to the reader. Are these structural factors weakening or intensifying?
And if they are intensifying, and the evidence suggests they are, then on what rational basis should the political system expect to avoid hyperinflation?
Are current actions addressing these structural roots or merely treating the symptoms?
If current actions are just rearranging the deck chairs, the collapse is inevitable. The weight of this analysis suggests that fundamental structural surgery is the only answer. But this analysis isn't just a critique. It leads to a necessity for, well, radical strategic change, one that completely reprioritizes the economy.
Right, and Dr. Hosseini provides historical context by recalling his 2016 preemptive warning.
What was the warning?
He argued that the U.S. political system's policy toward Iran would be characterized by contradiction and tension regardless of which party won the upcoming election, due to the overarching influence of the economic security elite.
So the opportunity for stable dialogue was inherently unstable.
It was. And this political instability demands a definitive internal pivot. The necessary strategic focus must be on achieving genuine economic independence, boosting domestic production, and making full employment the explicit strategic goal.
Using effective, proven economic models to achieve it, rather than just seeking short-term financial stability.
And the most transformative strategy proposed is a complete pivot to a green economy.
This is identified as the central strategic objective.
Yes. Shifting the economy away from reliance on volatile fossil fuels and toward renewable energy creates a massive, genuine space for job creation that doesn't rely on speculation, extraction, or export markets.
And this strategic pivot has to be driven by decentralized, participatory planning.
It's not enough to focus solely on improving national abstract economic indices like GDP or trade balances.
The planning process has to move from that top-down crisis management model to establishing local planning centers at the city and village level that encourage participatory, bottom-up budgeting.
This means local communities determine their own needs, prioritize environmental preservation, and implement projects focused on fulfilling those real needs, not merely maximizing market profit.
That's a profound rejection of central, market-driven policy in favor of localized, needs-based governance designed to rebuild the productive engine from the ground up.
So let's detail the specific policy mechanisms recommended for this massive transformation. They're wide-ranging and interconnected, all feeding into the twin goals of sustainability and full employment.
Okay, the first is the swift move to a green economy, not just conceptually, but through massive, concrete infrastructure projects.
Examples include the mandatory installation of local solar power plants across communities, creating localized energy independence.
And the comprehensive upgrading of public transport systems to run on renewable energy, creating millions of sustainable jobs in installation, maintenance, and operation.
And at the same time, intense focus must be placed on environmental care combating desertification and preserving the dwindling water resources.
Recognizing that ecological stability is foundational economic stability. If the land dies, the economy dies.
This requires localized, community-managed water allocation projects.
Then there's the transformation of agriculture via permaculture and organic agriculture.
The source explicitly cites successful models, like the one implemented in Cuba after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And these models focus on natural recycling, drastically reducing the dependence on chemical inputs and imported fertilizers, which are vulnerable to sanctions.
This is the path toward robust, self-sufficient, essential food production.
But perhaps the most radical structural shift, designed to specifically combat that speculative economy, is the promotion of the Mondragon model, democratic production cooperatives.
The system must move away from failed, non-democratic state cooperatives and establish new productive cooperatives managed democratically by the workers themselves, often organized in council structures.
Which eliminates the traditional capitalist divide between owners and labor.
Exactly.
That sounds, it sounds utopian. Given the entrenched political system you just described, how realistic is it to think democratic worker cooperatives can thrive when the system is actively designed to favor massive financial monopolies and Dalali?
That's a critical challenge.
Well, they just be starved of capital or bought out?
And the source addresses it by saying this has to be a state-led structural change, not a market experiment. The Mondragon model, which has been successful and enduring in Spain's Basque region, works because it requires workers to manage production, but critically, they share profits based on efficiency and productivity.
And they often operate their own internal credit union system.
Right. This creates a deeply embedded, productive, and anti-speculative form of capital because the income is generated from the act of production itself rather than from money games or asset holding.
So achieving this would require serious, dedicated parliamentary action.
Laws must be passed specifically to strengthen these worker-managed cooperatives, through targeted state mechanisms, low-interest loans, subsidies, tax facilities, and ensuring they align production with community needs rather than just pure short-term market profits.
It requires the state to actively choose production over speculation.
And finally, the bedrock of the entire socioeconomic system has to be solidified by essential social pillars.
This includes the immediate implementation of a comprehensive social security system to provide a safety net.
And a robust, comprehensive, and non-exploitable tax system designed specifically to fund welfare and job creation efforts, ensuring the tax burden falls on the speculative wealthy, not the productive workers.
And critically, education reform is necessary.
The model suggested is based on successful international systems like Finland's. Education must be free and public, and the goal should be to integrate public and private schooling systems to promote self-awareness and general knowledge, rather than being a tool for reproducing the existing social and economic inequality.
The conclusion is powerful, then. None of these fundamental steps can succeed without public participation.
If the solutions are imposed top-down, they will simply fail. Therefore, policies must be explicitly designed to encourage broad civic, popular, and decentralized engagement. Stepping back, the key insight Dr. Hosseini provides is that inflation in Iran is not merely a quantitative monetary problem that can be solved by manipulating a single interest rate or printing less money.
It's a profound symptom of deeper, highly interconnected structural weaknesses.
Entrenched class inequality, destructive speculative banking, political vulnerability driven by external pressures, and a systemic failure to prioritize productive, needs-based planning over financial engineering.
Understanding this really requires moving beyond simplified headlines and recognizing the profound difference between economic models designed for stable, developed nations versus those struggling with pervasive internal structural issues.
Where the mechanisms of wealth creation have themselves become inflationary, the entire analysis is a rejection of the idea that market mechanisms alone can heal structural wounds that are fundamentally political and social in nature.
So only comprehensive, systemic reform that empowers the productive class, rebuilds the local economy, and democratizes capital can break the cycle of the card house.
That's the argument.
If we pull back from the structural analysis, what's the consequence of this structural failure on the average citizen? I mean, the ultimate measure of stability isn't just controlling prices.
No, it's eliminating the non-productive, speculative ways to make money that currently dominate the economy, forcing capital back into creating real goods and real jobs.
So a final provocative thought for you to consider, based on the source.
If the political system fails to support decentralized, participatory, green economic solutions, if it continues to focus solely on managing the monetary variables and preserving the status quo of the financial monopolies, is it truly tackling the foundations of the card house or just rearranging the deck chairs while waiting for the next tremor to collapse the entire structure?
Structural problems require structural answers, not temporary financial fixes.
That's the bottom line.
Powerful questions that demand immediate structural action. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a complex and critical subject. We'll be back soon with another stack of sources to unpack.